If you ask me, one of the best parts of the Fate series is it's just so dang simple. Okay, maybe it's not as simple as it could be, but there are some parts that are pretty easy to understand. Namely, the servant classes. Whenever a heroic spirit is summoned as a servant, they're given a class that both kind of determines and also defines what their abilities are. And most of these are pretty simple to understand because they just relate to how does that heroic spirit prefer to fight. If you use a sword, then you're a saber. If you fight with magic, then you're a caster. If you fight with music, then you're also a caster. If you fight by writing books, then you're also a caster. Okay, maybe it's not a perfect system, but it does work most of the time. But then I started to wonder, what if belonging to a certain class could go beyond just how you fight? Do servants in the same class also show similarities in things like personality or behavior? And if I could find this kind of like archetype for a class, then what servant would best represent it? That's what this video is trying to find out. I'm not necessarily asking what servant is the strongest in each class, but which one best represents each class. And also along the way, we'll have to figure out what makes members of a class similar besides just how they fight. What is their archetype, so to speak? After going through every single servant in every single class, I think I've come up with a decent archetype for each of the 7 major classes, the 3 knight classes, saber, archer, and lancer, and also the 4 cavalry classes, rider, assassin, caster, and berserker. Join me, let's go through each class and try and figure out what is their archetype, and also who is the best representative of that class. 2 quick caveats I'm going to give before we get into the video. First off, I am not going to include any of the original servants from Fate Stay Night. I mostly did this just because I thought it would be really boring if I said, oh, the servant that best represents the saber class, saber. The servant that best represents the archer class, archer. And my second caveat is, of course, my archetypes aren't going to be perfect. They're not going to be able to describe every single servant in the category. I tried my best to make them as wide-ranging as possible, but you can only fit in so much. First, we're going to start with the class that I think is like the poster child for Fate, Saber. Something that we're repeatedly told about sabers, I think it's maybe the most common class-related description that we're given in any of the series, is that the saber is the most powerful class. Which doesn't that seem kind of unfair if right at the beginning of the tournament, they just point at one guy and they're like, oh yeah, you get the best one. Everyone else, yours kind of sucks. But I definitely think that has to be one of our criteria, is that the saber representative needs to be powerful. And probably because they're so powerful, saber servants generally don't use a lot of fancy tactics in battle compared to some of the other classes. A lot of the time, a saber strategy is pretty much just trying to blow the opponent away with just as much power as they can muster. Another thing that I noticed about sabers is they're a lot more heroic than other classes. A lot of saber servants are known for being brave, for giving of themselves onto others. And in fact, if we use the servants in Fate Grand Order specifically as a sample size, only 3 sabers are given the evil alignment. And in fact, of those 3, one of them is just the evil version of Artoria, so we can kind of take her out of the list. And then one of them is just the saber version of Mabe, who is a servant that is already in the evil category. That leaves us with only a single saber that is not an alt that is given the evil alignment. And that one servant that we get left with is Suzuka Gozen. I always knew that the face of evil was a Gyaro fox that acts like a high schooler. That all being said, our representative for the saber category should be powerful. When they fight, they should be very straightforward, just trying to blow the enemy away. And also, personality-wise, they're probably going to be heroic, selfless, and usually good aligned. I don't want to look at the green screen anymore. So we'll be at the beach now. For each class, I want to actually recognize 2 servants, the one that I think best describes it as an archetype, and then also just a runner-up. And our runner-up for the saber class is Barghest, who is from Fate Grand Order. Barghest, also known as Tamlin Gawain or Fairy Knight Gawain, is a black dog spirit from England who represents oncoming calamity. That's the actual historical person. And in the story of Fate Grand Order, Barghest kind of reflects this by being a literal calamity. She's a beast that basically will come and end the world. But this fate for her was kind of diverted by High Queen Morgan, who sort of managed to keep her impulses in check, and then used Barghest as one of her head knights. That's what the Tamlin is in the story. Barghest definitely meets the power criteria. She is basically a force that is able to end the civilization in the world that she comes from. And as a summonable servant, she really just kind of tanks damage and then sends it back full force. That's kind of her whole combat gimmick. But the reason why I let her be runner-up is because I think that she does still demonstrate kind of those heroic qualities that I associate with a saber, even though her fate kind of determines her to be more of a destructive force. I think she's really seen as a hero amongst the fairy population of Britain where she comes from, and even in the story she's able to cooperate with the protagonist even though they're kind of placed at odds at certain times. And I personally just put a lot of credit on the idea that even though you are destined to bring destruction, you're still kind of serving that heroic role that I would associate with a saber. Now, she definitely does do some pretty like reprehensible things to humans. That's why she's just getting the runner-up position. And instead, the servant that I think best represents the saber class as a whole would be Richard I from Fate's Strange Fate. In history, Richard was an English king who was famous for leaving his throne to go on adventures, particularly searching for evidence of the Arthurian legend. And this is reflected in the summonable servant in Fate's Strange Fate. Richard is very excitable. He's very like looking for adventure. And he also is obsessed with Arthurian legends. His strongest ability is that he can take anything and basically use it as an Excalibur. He can pick up a stick, say that it's Excalibur, and then use it like it was Excalibur, which of course in Fate means shooting lasers because that's what sabers do in Fate. Richard is also very straightforward. One of the first things that he does is he literally stands on top of a police car and basically proclaims himself to the world, which is kind of a bad thing to do in the world of Fate where magecraft is supposed to be kept secret. And he also demonstrates honor and goodness almost to a fault. He is really determined to save people. I think that there's even a part where he accidentally blows up a building and he's like, oh yeah, sure, you can arrest me. But then he changes his mind. But he was set on the idea of letting himself get arrested because he's like, oh yeah, no, I did break the law. That's understandable. And that's why I think for power, honesty, kind of just heroic nature, that's why I think that Richard I is probably the best representation of a saber in the franchise. So our next class is going to be archers. For archers, I do think that it is very important that they fight with a projectile. I don't want to include an archer that's given the role of archer, but they mostly fight like hand to hand. I feel like that kind of betrays the class. And also in contrast to our sabers, which I characterized as kind of heroic and good, archers are a lot more of a free spirit, almost to the point of being rebellious. One of the most characteristic skills of the archer class is independent action, which lets them operate independently from their master. So going on their own is kind of baked into the class. And in fact, if we look at the original archers from Fate's Stay Night, both of them do end up betraying their master depending on the route that you take. So I think that, again, that rebelliousness is very baked into the concept of the class. And speaking of those two archers, I think that they also kind of demonstrate the two classes that I would divide archers into. Archers are technically either a power type, meaning that they're really just trying to blow everything away with like a very strong projectile. So that would be something like Gilgamesh. Archers can also be more of like a mobile stealth class. They'll jump around, they'll try to lay traps and tricks. And that's closer to what Emiya does when you look at his variety of tools and also the kind of like underhanded tactics he'll make use of sometimes. So our criteria for archer are they need to fight with a projectile. They can either be a power type or a kind of stealth mobile type. And also they should be very independent and almost to the point of being rebellious. And with that criteria, the archer that I would give the place of runner-up, but who also kind of just represents the power type the best, would be Hercules from Fate's Strange Fate. They also refer to him as Alcides to kind of differentiate him between the Fate's Stay Night Hercules and the one in Fate's Strange Fate. Alcides is extremely strong. He's probably one of the strongest servants that we see in almost any Fate property, considering the opponents that he fights both early on in the series and then much later in the series. I won't go into specifics to not spoil, but they get pretty crazy. Also definitely does make good use of range tactics versus the Fate's Stay Night Hercules, who is much more kind of a hand-to-hand combatant. Also, he is definitely rebellious because one of the first things that he does upon being summoned, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, but it's only a spoiler for like the first time that he shows up. So if you want to not know what he does to make him rebellious, you can skip ahead to here. But immediately after being summoned, he can tell that his master is actually a very bad man. And the first thought in his head is, I need to kill this guy. So I think that immediately trying to kill your own master would definitely make you a very rebellious servant. So that's why I would give him runner up and also just kind of put him in first place for the power type specifically. And as for our first place, the person that I think best represents the archer class and also the one that I think best represents the archer class specifically in the kind of agility subtype would be Robin Hood, who first appears in Fate Extra. Robin Hood is an English folk hero. He's known for robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Robin Hood is very much characterized as a very tricky fighter. He tries to avoid hand-to-hand combat as much as he can. He's much more the type to fight with traps or poisons, and also hiding from a distance and kind of sniping the opponent when they can't see him. In fitting in with his kind of rebellious, free-spirited nature, his master is much more of kind of like an honorable guy. He's the one that would prefer having direct confrontation, but Robin goes and does his own thing. Again, very fitting of that archer quality of being a free spirit and kind of just choosing what you want to do regardless of what your master tells you. So next is Lancers, and I'm going to be honest with you. Lancers were the hardest one for me to come up with criteria for, because when you look at the Lancer category is probably the most varied. We have gods, kings, but also we have knights. We have real characters. We have fictional characters. We have good characters. We have evil characters. But I still did my best. Here's what I was able to come up with. First, Lancers very often receive the title of like the second best class after Sabers. They're very usually playing kind of a second fill to the Saber class. The difference between the two is that the Sabers are kind of, again, the more honorable, direct fighters, while Lancers are a bit more scrappy, they're a bit more agile, they'll pull a bit more like tactics in a fight. And then honestly, besides that, I was struggling to find any other criteria. The only one that I could come up with is they are a very youthful class. We have members of this class that are the younger versions of servants in other classes, such as Medusa Lily, servants that have like kind of a eternal youth aspect to them, like Enkidu. And also, if you look at the servant Summer Ilia, she has a skill that only buffs child servants. So looking at this, we can tell what in Fate Grand Order is considered a child servant. And of this group, the largest percentage belongs to the Lancer class. So again, this is honestly the class criteria that I feel the least confident in, but so that we have something to work with. I would say that Lancers are generally almost as strong as Sabers, but a bit more tricky, a bit more agile, a bit less direct. They also should demonstrate a degree of youthfulness. With that being said, who do I think best represents the Lancer class? Our runner-up is Neza, who is from Fate Grand Order, and whose real-world counterpart is a character in Journey to the West. I give Neza the runner-up spot because she is extremely mobile. Actually, she's one of the few servants that is almost always flying, so obviously that makes her very mobile. And then the other unique thing about her is that she's also one of the only servants that actually was reincarnated during her own life. In the story of Journey to the West, her character died and then was reincarnated. Not only was she a servant who was given life in the modern day, even in her own story, she was given a second chance at youth. So I would give that enough points to put her in the runner-up position. So then the character that ends up in first place, our representative of the Lancer class, would be Diermued, who is from Fate Zero. Oh, and in the real world, Diermued is a Celtic warrior. The reason why I give it to Diermued is that he really does kind of embody that second best to Saber and very agile aspect of being a Lancer. In Fate Zero, he does have fights with the Saber Artoria, and it really is that resourcefulness that lets him make up the difference between their respective amounts of power. We can also see that if we look at his stats, agility is his strongest attribute. The reason why I give him points toward being youthful is that one of his main attributes is that he is almost supernaturally attractive, to the point that he literally needs to like brush off women because they're so attracted to him. Well, attractiveness does not directly relate to youth. I think he is much more of a like young, handsome guy than a silver fox. But ultimately, like I said before, I kind of hate this category. I could not think of any really good criteria. This is probably the one that I feel the worst about. So let's keep moving. Yo, I felt like moving again. Well, we are halfway through the video, so if you're enjoying it and you want to subscribe, that'd be cool. Also, let me know if you'd like me to do a similar video, but for the extra classes. But now we're getting out of the knight classes and into the cavalry classes. And thank God, because I found the cavalry classes so much easier to come up with criteria for. So we're going to start with Rider, and I think that Rider is like the one with my biggest fan service picks. You'll see when we get to who I think is at number 1 and number 2. So for Rider, I think that the most important criteria is that, like with the Archer, they should actually live up to their name. They should actually be riding something. I don't care how fast you run. If you're not actually riding something, I can't give you the title of the archetypal rider. And you get more points the better you are at riding, and also the more often you are riding. So someone that only rides during their Noble Phantasm will get less points than someone that's riding like all the time. And personality-wise, I noticed that riders are very straightforward, which is appropriate for the class, where most of the time your thing that you're going to be doing is just driving at someone, hitting them with the Azrael, hitting them with their car. And I also noticed that riders are very gregarious. They are probably the class that is the best at working with people. You can see that with riders that are just normally friendly, but also a lot of riders that are in positions of leadership. So people like rulers, or people that are like the captains of ships. With that being said, my pick for the runner-up in the rider category, the servant that I think is the second best representative of the class, is Astolfo. Like I said, this is definitely the fan service section of the video. The historical Astolfo is a French knight of Charlemagne, and Astolfo the servant was first summoned in Fate Apocrypha, although he's shown up since then pretty often in games like Fate Grand Order. And Astolfo very well meets all of our criteria. He is extremely straightforward to the point that I would even call him ditzy. People think that he's an idiot. Even his own description basically talks about him like he's insane. And he is also extremely friendly and gregarious. He is the type of character that is always trying to make friends with other people. And to meet that riding criteria, Astolfo's steed is actually a hippogriff. And while he doesn't ride it all the time, he is a very experienced rider. Don't take that out of context. And is noted for being able to reach extremely fast speeds. So Astolfo on his own is, I think, a fantastic representative of the rider class, but there is one servant that I think does represent it just a little bit better. And that, of course, is Iskander or Alexander the Great from Fate Zero. I told you this is going to be the very fan service category. Versus Astolfo, who, like I said, is not always riding his steed, Iskander is always riding. He's one of the few units in FGO who is just literally always on his horse. And when we do see him riding in battle, he does show that high level of expertise that I'm looking for in our representative. He is also very straightforward. He's definitely the type to just say, well, why don't we just charge ahead and do this? And honestly, I would challenge you to find a servant that is more gregarious than Iskander. There is a whole group of other characters in Fate whose whole life is based around the fact that they are followers of him. He knew Waver for a week and managed to completely change his life. Literally, his noble phantasm is just him calling up his boys to help him out. You cannot get more gregarious than Iskander. He just tops the list. It's easy. The next category that I want to look at is the servants that study at the library, the casters. So as hinted to, the biggest criteria for a caster is they are the intelligent combatants. They are going to show a great degree of intelligence or wisdom. And also, they are usually the ones that are the most talented in magecraft, hence why they are casters, because they cast magic. Get it? It's pretty obvious. Like I said, they are training at the library, so in comparison to the other classes, casters are also going to typically be a lot more physically weak. They might be able to destroy a human in combat, but versus other servants, they're generally a lot weaker in that stat. However, to make up for this, I think that casters are generally much better strategists than the servants in other classes. And also, a lot of them have high ranks of the item and territory creation skills, meaning they're able to either construct items to fights, or they're able to manipulate the area around them to make an environment that's more conducive for their fighting. For example, take Medea in Fate Stay Night, who is basically able to turn the town of Fuyuki into her own little mana collection space. So our caster should be strong of mind, but weak of body. They should be very strategic, and they should also be adept at creating items or manipulating the environment around them. And with that said, I think an easy runner-up would be Alexander Dumas from Fate Strange Fake. Actual Dumas was a French author, and the servant version kind of demonstrates this background by having his main ability be writing. Dumas never gets into combat on his own. He has, I don't think in the entire series, actually gotten into a fight. Instead, what he is able to do is basically craft legends that empower objects and turn them into low-level noble phantasms that other people can wield. So I think that is a perfect representation of how a caster would do combat in a Holy Grail War. They are not getting into combat on their own at all. They are fighting almost exclusively through creating magic items and giving them to other people. However, the historical Dumas is not actually known to be a mage, so that's why I only give him runner-up. Instead, the servant that I think best represents the caster class, who is described in their own description as being a mage, even though in real life that's not really what they were known for, but whatever, is our girl, Leonardo da Vinci from Fate Grand Order. The actual historical Da Vinci was an Italian inventor and painter. And while the Da Vinci that we summon in Fate Grand Order does show a lot of these qualities, being a very accomplished inventor and also being extremely intelligent, there are some key differences that make me want to give her the title of the best representative of the caster class. Chaldea Da Vinci definitely demonstrates her abilities as a strategist, considering that she's basically taken on as one of the heads of the Chaldea operations during the time that she summons. So she is so good in this role, she's better than just a servant, she's essentially a member of the staff. We also see her invent a number of very important technologies over the course of the story, and then I think the strongest evidence in support of Da Vinci is that she is such an adept mage that she's able to edit her own summoning in order to change what her body looks like. That being able to literally change your own summoning has to put you at the top of the caster list. That's extremely impressive. The penultimate class that I'd like to talk about is the assassin class. Assassin class. The assassin class. Assassin class. If we look at all the assassins, we're going to notice that they have some very significant differences from a lot of the classes that we've talked about so far. In fact, if you want, you can say that assassins as a class are almost the exact opposite of sabers as a class. Assassins are very weak direct combatants. They much prefer to fight via underhanded tactics. As such, they're very skilled at being coverts, and a lot of them have the presence concealment skill in order to make themselves almost invisible. Also, in contrast to the more heroic, good-natured sabers, a lot of assassins are instead evil and ruthless. And that's not just me libeling them. Again, if we use Fate Grand Order as a sample size, only 9 of the assassins in Fate Grand Order are given the good alignments. When we're looking for our archetypal assassin, they should preferably be evil and ruthless. They should be covert, very good at going undercover. They should not be very skilled in direct combat. And also, I'm going to give bonus points to servants that use poison. Poison is also very characteristic of the assassin class, and also to any servant that was known as a killer in history. And speaking of a killer in history, our runner-up is Jack the Ripper, who is most prominently featured in Fate Apocrypha. This is like the 4th video where I've talked about Jack, and I still will be able to only use like the same 4 pictures for her because she won't get any goddamn pan. So Jack gets high points in the archetypal assassin competition because, as I mentioned, they are based on the real-world serial killer, Jack the Ripper. I'm also giving them points towards that covert classification because they were never identified during their own time. Yes, I did hear all the comments on the last video about the fact that people are saying that Jack the Ripper has been identified since then, but you gotta remember that wasn't the case when the character was written. That's why it's based in her character. Jack is also almost inarguably evil. They are a real-world serial killer, after all. They were noted for being particularly ruthless. That's where the Ripper part of Jack the Ripper comes from. Also, stealth is a major component of their kits. One of the biggest things that they can do is summon mist that basically hides their presence. However, the servant that I give a little bit more of an edge, and therefore is our winner of Archetypal Assassin, is the Hassan of Serenity from Fate Prototype. So if you know Fate, then you know that traditionally, the Hassans are actually the only type of servant that is supposed to be summoned in the Assassin class. This is because the historical people were so adept at killing that the word assassin is derived from their name. And while I'm not saying that only the Hassans could have won in this competition, I definitely think that it's worth at least a few points. The Hassans do meet a lot of the criteria I'm looking for in my archetypal assassin. They're all of the evil alignment, they're all quite ruthless. And the reason why they're all known as Hassan of the Blank is because they're all meant to be nameless, which fits in very well with that whole covert characteristic that I was describing before. But of all the Hassans, why do I give the title to Hassan of Serenity specifically? The reason is because her whole gimmick is based around poison. Hassan of Serenity is meant to be a representation of the story of the poison girl who has been exposed to so many poisons over her entire life that her body itself becomes poison. All of her bodily secretions are poison. Her skin is poisonous. Because of this, the Hassan of Serenity really doesn't engage in direct combat. Instead, the way that she kills her target is by romancing them, and then when they come into contact with her skin, they just die from an overdose of poison. So for being the Hassan that is most experienced in poison and as a result needs to engage in almost no direct combat, I think that it's pretty fair to give the archetypal assassin to Hassan of Serenity. I return myself to my green screen hell for our last category, Berserkers. Berserker honestly might have been the easiest class to write a description for because they really don't usually have a lot going on, like personality-wise. Most Berserkers, if not all Berserkers, have undergone something called a Madness Enhancement. A Madness Enhancement is essentially the Berserker trading their sanity for physical strength. And so those are two of our biggest criteria for a Berserker. They need to be extremely physically strong, And they also need to have lost their sanity either entirely or at least to a significant degree. And this loss of sanity also means that berserkers are usually very hard to control. They're either extremely violent and will just attack anyone, or they're just going to go off and try to do their own thing based on whatever remnants of sanity that they have left. And then lastly, I think that another important criteria of a berserker, something that is a commonality amongst a lot of them, is that they usually are very good at tanking attacks. Heracles from Fate Stay Night is of course a perfect example of this. His noble phantasm allows him to die multiple times and then just come back to life. So with that being said, our archetypal berserker should be very physical. They should have lost their sanity and be hard to control, and they should also be very tanky. And our runner-up in this category is Mori Nagayoshi from Fate Grand Order. Mori is a Japanese warrior that shows up in a lot of the Nobunobu events, and he is characterized as very hungry for a fight, very bloodthirsty, and he's also shown to be very tanky. Him dying is very often played off as a joke in the story. If we want more evidence, he is also a servant that shows up in Fate type Redline, where literally the first thing that he does is escape containment, charge through a facility, kill like everybody that's there, meanwhile kidnapping his master and basically saying like, oh hey master, let's go see what's up. So I think that he definitely fits the criteria of extremely hard to control. However, believe it or not, he is still actually a little bit more sane than most berserkers. He's able to have like a coherent conversation with someone. So the servant that I would give the archetypal berserker title to is Spartacus from Fate Apocrypha. Spartacus is literally the perfect example of everything that I've described so far. He is hugely muscular. One of his descriptions in Fate Grand Order literally just calls him like a slab of meat. Oh no, I think it says that man was all muscle. I'm pretty sure that's the loading screen that you see all the time that refers to Spartacus. He's also extremely hard to control. One of the first things that he does in Fate Apocrypha is pretty much just run into combat all on his own. He's also extremely tanky. His noble phantasm is basically him taking in a bunch of damage and then returning it at the opponent. And what gives him the edge over Mori is that he is totally insane. His existence is based around ending oppression, so he'll go around calling everybody oppressors, asking if they're oppressors, saying his opponents are oppressors and that oppression needs to be defeated. And no matter what someone says to him, that will not like get into his head. In my mind, the tankiest, least sane, most physically based berserker is Spartacus. Ultimately, all of these are my opinion. These are just what I've noticed by looking at all the different servants and trying to find these patterns. For you, there might be something else that you think is more important, something that is more central to the identity of each of these different classes. So let's have a discussion. Let me know, is there anything that you would change? Are there any criteria that you think are more important? Is there any servant that you think would fit the title of each of these classes better? Let me know. I think it's really cool to hear other people's opinions. And hey, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.